Welcome to No Filter Doctor, where we cut through the health hype and dig into what's real, what works, and what's backed by evidence. I'm Dr. AK. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me today. I am super excited about today's topic. It is genetics versus epigenetics. And so this is a very exciting topic. There's a lot of research being done in this field, and I think it's worth talking about because when we talk about different disease states, people tend to confuse how much control they actually have over what happens in their bodies. When we say the word genetics, people often think of these irreversible traits that they got from their parents, right? Something like eye color, hair color, maybe even the predisposition for certain diseases. But epigenetics is a very exciting field because you can control how some of your genes are actually expressed. Before I get into the meat and potatoes of all of this, I do have to let you all know that my dog, Duncan, is in my office with me, and he's not feeling very great today. So I have him hanging out, and he's just making all kinds of weird-ass noises. So if you hear these different noises in the background, it is Duncan, and c'est la vie, right? I'm going to have to go ahead and move on and do what I can while the little pup is hanging out with me. So sorry, folks, this is life. All right, a discussion about genetics warrants at least a basic understanding of the language. And there's a lot of language here to know. Personally, I'm a visual learner. So if you're a visual learner and not driving, feel free to hit pause and look up some of these things. Otherwise, I'm going to do the best that I can to try and describe everything to you. The first thing you need to know about is the term nucleotides. These are the basic building blocks of DNA and RNA. There's 4 of them: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And they make up your entire genetic structure, right? They make the DNA, they make the RNA. They also pair with each other. So adenine and thymine are basically dating. They always hang out and they bond with one another. Cytosine and guanine do the same. This is going to be important in 1 second. If you think of the classic double helix structure of DNA, right? It looks like a ladder that you then twisted in kind of a corkscrew pattern. The nucleotides form the sides of the ladder, the railing of the ladder, if you will. And their bonds form the rungs that are in the middle of the ladder. So that's what the basic structure of DNA is. It's the nucleotides that are in an infinite number of different combinations on each side of those rails, and then them bonding with each other, forming the rungs of the ladder. Oh, and by the way, DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Genes are specific segments of the DNA. Those 4 nucleotides that we talked about, they also make up the genes. Depending on kind of what the pattern is, will determine what the gene is. Genes are responsible for making different proteins and RNA. RNA is known as ribonucleic acid, and rather than being a double strand of those nucleotides, it's just one single strand. And it makes all the different proteins and different things that we need in our body, basically for survival. RNA, I don't know of any life form that can actually exist without RNA, to be honest with you. I mean, even some viruses, which technically don't count as a life form, we won't get into all of that. They are made of RNA as well. So this is really just kind of the basics. Now, what happens when we put it all together? DNA doesn't freely float around in the cell. It's not just kind of floating and doing whatever. It's wrapped around different proteins that are called chromosomes, and humans have 46 of them, most humans. There are certain genetic conditions where you don't have 46 chromosomes, but in general, there's 23 pairs. Half of that comes from the sperm, half of it comes from the egg, and these hang out in the nucleus of just about every single cell in the body. If we put all of this together, then you have 4 nucleotides combining in an infinite number of ways to create genes. Those genes make up our DNA, which consists of a ladder that looks like it's twisted into a corkscrew. The DNA wraps around different proteins to form chromosomes, and then the chromosomes are hanging out inside every single cell, and it carries all of our genetic information and helps our body make different proteins and RNAs, and that's how we survive. That was a super simplified version of my first year of college and the genetics course I had to take. There you go. To all of you, if you happen to be a genetics professor and you're listening, please be kind. I'm doing my best here. You are not the target audience. The way all of this relates is what those genes do in our body. For example, there is a medical condition known as cystic fibrosis. This is caused by a mutation in the CFTR gene, which leads to thickened mucus in the lungs and in the GI tract. That can lead to troubles breathing, pneumonia, pancreatitis. There are some cancers that this is associated with. The BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene mutation increases the lifetime risk of breast cancer and ovarian cancer. There are also other medical conditions. Remember I said most of us have 46 chromosomes? Well, Down syndrome is having an extra copy of chromosome 21. It just so happened that chromosome 21 did not separate properly during the development of an egg or a sperm, and so you end up having this extra one. And there's also other conditions as well, but I am trying to make this not the most boring podcast you've ever heard. That's the background information that you need to know. Genetics, those conditions, they happen, and there's really nothing you can do about it. But the exciting part is the epigenetics. Epigenetics doesn't rewrite those nucleotides, right? We talked about that. Those nucleotides are going to stay the same forever. But what it does is it influences how your body reads them. And I guess let's use an example of like a light, right? So if your genes are a light bulb, the epigenetics is a dimmer switch. So the light bulb is going to be wired in the house. You know, the house is built, everything's wired, those lights are there, and it's not going to change. Epigenetics acts like the dimmer switch. Some of those lights can be turned on, some can be dimmed, some can be turned off completely. The way epigenetics works in terms of gene expression is through 3 different mechanisms. One of them is something called DNA methylation, and this is when a methyl group gets added to a DNA molecule. Another one is histone modification. Remember when I was talking about DNA wraps around certain proteins? Well, those are the histones, those proteins. And so those can change, which can affect gene expression. And then the last one is non-coding RNA or RNA interference. These RNAs, they don't actually create proteins. They participate in gene silencing. I'm honestly not even sure that you need to know those 3 mechanisms, but I'm a nerd. So for the fellow nerds, there, I gave you that extra bit of information. Our different exposures, different things that we do, things like stress or what we eat, whether we exercise, how we sleep, all of these things can affect one of those 3 different pathways. And through that is where you can influence the expression of different genes. So all of that is epigenetics. I was searching through literature and I found some pretty interesting studies that talk about epigenetics. One of them looked at identical twins. Obviously, identical twins are just the perfect population to do any kind of epigenetic study in because genetically, right, when it comes down to the pattern of the nucleotides to form the DNA, they're exactly the same in identical twins. And this study looked at these twins that had the same genetic blueprint, but found as the twins age, their risk of disease often diverges depending on their lifestyle and their environment that they're in. Another study looked at the effect of smoking and found that smoking often causes that DNA methylation that we talked about before. So certain genes can be switched on, and it just so happens that a lot of those genes drive inflammation and cancer. And these changes can even occur as early as in utero in women who smoke. Drinking alcohol can also influence gene expression, and it can lead to all kinds of different conditions in the liver, the heart, the blood, the brain. I'm not going to lie, this one kind of freaked me out when I first read it, but there's good news. It's not permanent in a lot of cases if you are making better choices later in life. And that to me is the best part. The fact that we have some degree of control over the expression of these genes. And the things that we can do to nudge our genes in the right direction, you're not going to be surprised. It actually happens to be the same different things that lifestyle medicine is based on, right? So the 6 pillars. So we're just going to go through there real quickly. There were multiple studies that looked at nutrition and demonstrated that dietary vitamins such as folate, vitamin B, vitamin A, vitamin D, zinc, and bioactive food compounds, all of these highly nutritious foods can modulate gene expression and alter DNA methylation, right? So if you have a lot of DNA methylation from other things that have changed your epigenetics, you can change your diet into a high nutrition, a nutrient-dense diet, and reverse some of that DNA methylation. I mean, that's a big plus. Exercise is also a huge one where you can change the epigenetics in your skeletal muscles, your adipose tissue, and your blood cells. This all improves your metabolic regulation. It can downregulate inflammation, mitochondrial function, which is huge when we're talking about longevity and anti-aging, is improved, and then muscle adaptation improves. Sleep can also influence epigenetics. You know, before I left academic medicine and was working full-time in the emergency department, I had to do a lot of different shift work, and we would flip a lot. Like you would be a day shift one day, and then you would be overnight another day. And that lack of sleep and lack of regulation, I mean, I could personally really feel it in my body. Well, there's studies that basically say, yeah, what I felt was a thing. Because when you are sleep deprived, you can have these increases in histone changes and DNA methylation. And whenever you have better sleep and better sleep duration, you can reverse them. I already mentioned alcohol and smoking and how they can change the epigenetics in a negative way. So obviously avoiding them can improve things. And I think, that rounds out the obvious, right? Nutrition, exercise, sleep, and then avoiding things that could be considered a toxin. But one that I found interesting, and I didn't really know about these two until I prepared all of this, was the effects of stress. Now, a lot of you don't know this, but in my former professional life, I did a lot of research in physician burnout and stress and how we deal with stress, particularly stress mindsets and how we can choose our physiologic stress response. So, of course, I found this very interesting because a lot of it has to do with cortisol mediation. There were some studies that looked at interventions such as mindfulness-based practices and psychotherapy and demonstrated there is a modulation of epigenetic patterns. They can reverse stress-induced epigenetic changes. That is pretty cool. I never knew that stress had that profound of an effect on us all the way down to genetic expression. So that I found interesting. Another thing that I found interesting was the connection with social interactions and different relationships with people. And so the more supported you are, the more meaningful social connections you have an association with better epigenetic aging markers, independent of health behaviors and other positive things that are going on in your life, the obvious ones, right? So the fact that social connections can give us positive epigenetic changes, I think is pretty profound. And again, I'm just going to say that those are the 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine: nutrition, exercise, how we move, sleep, stress reduction, social connections, and avoiding toxins. Like there's no hacks here. There's no extra supplements we have to take. We don't have to put any money into big pharma pockets. It's literally just making some lifestyle modifications that can improve our overall epigenetics. Okay, so I gave you all of these different kind of like vague examples, but here is one that is real life and it's very interesting. So let's just step back. You have a lipoprotein in your body called apolipoprotein E, and everyone has this in their body. There are 3 different phenotypes. There's type 2, 3, and 4. And everyone has 2 copies of apolipoprotein E. There's no way to change this genetic combination. You might be 2-2, 2-3, 3-4, 4-4, whatever. We know individuals who are ApoE4 phenotypes are at the highest risk of developing Alzheimer's dementia. But exercise and nutrition can influence the epigenetic expression of ApoE4, and there were studies that actually proved this. They looked at patients who had neurodegenerative disorders, things like dementia, and what they found was that depending on people's exercise and nutrition, they could influence their onset of dementia. I mean, and some people were able to even just not develop dementia, which I think is remarkable. If you look up MINDS diet, MINDS, I don't know what it is, like Mary, Indigo, November, Delta, Sierra. I know I didn't do the M right, but I want you to understand what I'm saying. The MINDS diet, if you do like a Google Scholar search on that, you will find an overwhelming amount of literature that shows how it improves the onset of dementia. Again, maybe you can't change getting it, but if you can slow the rate, I think that's huge. Think of how many lives could be impacted in a positive way by delaying or stopping the onset of dementia just through some lifestyle modifications. Not saying they don't need medication, not saying there aren't other things that are influencing, but the fact that you can influence this ApoE4 expression through epigenetics with exercise and nutrition is huge, in my opinion. There's also a lot of interesting research being done right now with epigenetic expression and inherited generational trauma. Now, I don't know enough about this topic to really do a deep dive. I was just at a retreat this past weekend, and there were a few people that were discussing this. So, of course, I'm going to have to look into the literature myself because I'm just such a skeptic, and I cannot accept certain things at face value, especially if my gut is like, I'm not sure about that. So stay tuned because I do want to look into that, and I'm probably going to do a future blog or podcast on that as well. But for now, know that while you do have your genetics that you cannot change, other decisions in your life, as simple as lifestyle modifications, can change that gene expression and do a lot in terms of your overall health, lifespan, and aging. Pretty cool stuff. Thank you so much for joining me this week on No Filter Doctor. What you do need to keep in mind is that while I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So anything that we discuss on this podcast is not medical advice. And listening to this podcast does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. The purpose of this podcast is for information purposes only. Any questions or decisions that you want to make about your healthcare should be discussed with your doctor or other healthcare provider. Making healthcare decisions without discussing it first with your doctor or other healthcare provider is done so at your own risk.